Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Marlon James Briggs. Myself, Abram, and Paulette are all counselors at University Counseling Services at Cal State Northridge. And we all thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to speak to you and present our information to hopefully help this conversation move along around anti-Blackness. And so, you know, when I first hear that word, I know it kind of strikes me a little bit differently. Like, what do we mean when we say anti-Blackness, right? And so we'll be explaining as we go through the differences between participating in racism actively in a racist form, not participating, right? And then actively being an anti-racist. And we're going to go through and define those things. But first and foremost, I just wanted to welcome everybody to the space and say thank you for coming. Thank you for your eyes and your ears. And what we're going to do, because we're counselors, right? We're therapists. What we like to do is invite people to consider things. And what we want to do today is invite you to consider what this space is and what it means to you. Right? Everybody has motives. Everybody has reasons for coming into spaces like this, whether they want to check their own biases or they want to learn how to be advocates for another group, or they want to learn how to dismantle things in their own lives and offices and institutions, right? So what we want to do, what we want to invite you to do while you're in this space and you are lending us your ear is to think about why you are here. What specifically are you here to address or to look at or to gain more knowledge around, right? And as therapists, what we also do is we look at goals, right? We're working towards a goal. So we all came into this experience wanting to get something. So why are we here and what is the goal of this is what we want you to keep in mind as we're sharing our history, as we're sharing our stories with you, as we're looking at ways to establish an anti-Black discuss anti-Blackness as a mindset and how to kind of dismantle that, right? And so what we want to do is just kind of show a video to you first to prime the ground for what we'll be talking about today and how we'll be exploring this topic. And then after we come back from that video, I'll say a few more words about what we're doing before I hand it over to my colleagues, okay? So if we can play that video.
Always taught to be strong in this world. Told to never let my guard down because at any moment I could be attacked without a moment's notice. That my skin made me a target. Skin that has persevered through many trials and tribulations, from seeing my mama raped by landlords, to my father being beaten and stripped of his manhood, to my brothers and sisters being separated into jobs for this bigger system. My skin has always been under attack. Yet somehow we prevailed through it all, through all the lynchings, literacy tests, new Jim Crows, war on drugs, the gentrifications, police brutalities, food deserts, mass incarcerations. We survived and adapted and pushed to change because our very existence depended on it. Our very existence depends on this Black strength. Strength that has carried us for decades, but is undermining an important aspect of our humanity and feeding in on itself. Being strong all the time took away our ability to speak about our weaknesses, our sadness, our mental illnesses. This silence is killing us. On top of that, we lack proper mental health care access and endure mistreatments by medical professionals who cannot relate to us in their practice. On top of that, we stigmatize mental illness to preserve this place of our strength, damaging ourselves, and among Black children observing a spike in suicide rates because they may feel that their place in heaven is way better than their place here today, because when Black life isn't valued enough for professional help, adequate housing, or even breathing, life here degrades in value in comparison to life after. Black bodies, strong Black souls are floating through the wind, seamlessly letting go. Strong Black bodies are screaming for help, but suffering in silence and being socially and systematically being put on quiet. Black souls are strong. But we do need help when we do fall through the cracks. That is why I want you to know that you can patch things up with me. All right, we can kick it back like it was a drive-through movie in the 1970s. We can get some help from people who actually understand us, refute our standards of stigmatizing mental illness, and fight against the structures that chronically misdiagnose what this really is. Fight against the racism that brings up our mental health issues and lowers our treatment options, bringing us one step closer to seeing no other option. I want us to see that we have a way to heal this wound that has been widening ever since day one with no means of contracting. I want us to know that the seed that we sow today is the harvest we reap tomorrow. And when we finally reap, we can find peace in these moments, noticing that the danger isn't gone, but we finally have a place where it feels like it is, the grounding of Black bodies.
Right. That was a powerful video. At least every time that I watch it, it really strikes me. And, I think it plays perfectly into our topic today about anti-Blackness. What that young man was really speaking about was about creating safety, right? Creating safety in homes, creating safety outside, creating safety in institutions, creating a place where Black people can feel not at risk or not in imminent danger of harm, right? Or can feel understood or settled. And that's what the core of what we're talking about is today, how to deconstruct that anti-Blackness so that we can begin as a community, as a state, as a nation, as a world, to begin to make spaces safe for Black people and what that looks like. So I want to invite you today, as we're going through our discussion, to be open with your mind, be open with your heart. And when we talk about that, really invest in what we're doing, because we're moving towards something, especially in today's society. And I am so glad to see all of you here to be able to participate in that. So as we move on, I will turn it over to my co-facilitator, Dr. Abram Milton, and I will talk to you all later in the presentation. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Marlon. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. As they mentioned, I'm Dr. Abram Milton, but I feel like within this CSUN community, we are all colleagues who are wanting to kind of help explore things in relation to CSUN. So definitely, moving forward, I want to be called Abram as we go in this space where we can have these challenging and difficult conversations. I'm just so humbled that seeing the participants here now wanting to assist in what we can do for CSUN and for these students, because as my colleagues, Marlon and Paulette can tell you, students who are already coming in our office, are already having these conversations about their hopes and about different kind of expectations that they're talking about these topics within. So with that, I want to just kind of let each and every one of you know a little bit about how we're going to structure the discussion groups today. So as you can see on the screen, we have 3 of the discussion topics. However, I just want to emphasize on discussion topic 1 and discussion topic 2. We're going to have those, we're going to do those within breakout groups. We're going to separate the groups and we can explore within smaller numbers. However, before we break down into those individual groups, Paulette, Marlon, and I are going to give some more context and share some of our stories and share some more information to assist. So we're basically, as we're going through, my colleague Paulette will give some historical information. We will share some things on discussion topic 1. Then we're going to transition to sharing stuff about discussion topic 2. And then we will break down to those groups to explore those 2 questions for about 15 minutes, give or take. So that way we can have within those smaller numbers, right? And so then with that, And as we move forward here, I wanted to talk a little bit about ground rules. I know we don't have a specific slide, but I'm going to just verbalize just real briefly that we know this is a safe and confidential space that we'll be able to talk in, right? That that confidentiality should be acknowledged, right, and honored, and that we each individual will speak for themselves because no one individual can speak for our entire population. We'll use this space to continue to learn from each other, to continue practicing active listening. All y'all contributions matter, and that we'll continue to practice mutual respect because I feel like with this, that this can be a very deep and moving topic. So with that being said, I'm going to turn over the conversation to my colleague, Dr. Paulette, to go ahead and start us on our journey.
Thank you, Abram, and thank you, Marlon, and thank you, Break the Silence Initiative, for having us here today. So it's my job to support our position that Blacks have not been welcome as equal participants to contribute to or benefit from the society in which we live. We're going to take a quick jaunt through history and bring us up to the present. As you can see, this slide says a few good white men. Let's start with what we call the forefathers of our nation and bring us up to the present. We all know that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but not all of us know that he did his best to keep the Union together because there were about 30 states during that time, 14 of whom were states of the Confederacy that Jefferson Davis was the president over. And so for Abraham Lincoln, he was more concerned about preserving the Union so that the country would not fall apart. And he did this by, during his inaugural speech in 1862, letting the Senate know that he was willing to extend slavery. Some historians tell us he was willing to extend it for another 37 years. Not only did he do that, he also met with a group of what he called Committee of Colored Men, one of whom Mr. Douglas was a part of, and he encouraged them to gather people, free people, to go to Liberia or Central America. At that time, Liberia was founded by free people of color from the US, and it began as a settlement of the American Colonization Society. They were trying to get Black folk that were free to go there so that our folk went back to the continent. And so Lincoln was all for that. As I said, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation in '63. And we also know through history that it wasn't until a couple of years later that General Granger at Galveston, Texas, let 4 million remaining Blacks free, so to say. Yeah, they were free, but free to what is the question? We may not all agree that Lincoln did everything bad or everything right, but what we can all agree about is that the institution of slavery was morally repugnant. Would you go to the next slide, please? So let's continue with a few good white men. George Washington, first president. He actually owned over 300 slaves. And if he was living today, he would be worth $530 million. His view on slavery was that it meant profits through tobacco and grain. Another good white man. Let's look at the next slide, please. Thomas Jefferson. You know what he did in terms of getting us together in terms of our Constitution, how he wrote that very important piece of paper. Well, we also know through history that in his 40s, he took a young Sally Hemings who was only 14 years old, not to have an extramarital affair, which some people like to say. In reality, he raped her for 37 years. He fathered, according to literature, either 4 or 6 children, whoever you want to believe, but at least 4 children were his. And his view on slavery was that he didn't want to stop it because he was afraid of revenge. I guess he had good reason to think that. Our next slide, please. So you say, okay, the founding fathers were not all that bad, not all that good, but there was Reconstruction. Well, let's look at what happened to Reconstruction. There was no infrastructure for Blacks in order to be able to develop an economic base and participate fairly in the labor force, or even become formally educated, or develop a process to acquire land ownership. We found what a lot of the freed people did was those who had little bits of money here and there, they would put them together. They would buy land, and on the land, the first thing they would build were churches. And through the church, the Black church, they would have their educational center, their political center, everything to help them move together as a group. But there was no infrastructure that was given after the slaves were freed. No infrastructure for obtaining proper housing, to avoid or escape law enforcement, leaving Blacks prey to human atrocities. Next slide, please. Then there was the Jim Crow era. We know about that. Never mind all the lynchings that happened. There's one scholar from Harvard who said, our state of California had close to 300 lynching trees. Whether that's true or not, any lynching tree in California is just unconscionable to think about. And when we think about our history, it's important to go into the literature to find out what really happened. Next slide, please. So there was a civil rights movement. Well, we know that different aspects and different things led up to the movement. If we look at Linda Brown versus the Board of Education, and if we look at what happened to Emmett Till, these were two youngsters. Linda was 7 years old when she was escorted by the National Guard to learn, to get an education. Can you imagine your 7-year-old being escorted to school that way? Let's not forget Emmett Till, 14 years old. And yes, he had to talk with his mother because even though he was from Chicago, there were places even in Chicago he knew how to be deferential. So when he went to the South, there was nothing that he did in Mississippi to bring about what happened to him. About 2.5 years later, Miss Bryant, who accused him, recanted the entire thing. Too late for him and too late for his family. Next slide, please. So as we continue to look at this period, the civil rights movement, we know that Miss Rosa Parks would not give up her seat, but do we realize that a few days before was when the whole situation happened with Emmett Till? So she sat on that bus, she said she thought about him. She could not move, she refused to move. We also know that the gentleman who drove the bus, his name was Blake, they knew each other. And she had vowed to never get on another one of his buses because she had witnessed the bus driver spitting on Blacks as they left his bus and yelling curses after them. But she was tired that they should just got on the bus. She wanted to go home. And when she sat down, she looked up, she saw who was driving the bus. It was like, oh, shoot, I'm on this man's bus. Then she decided she wasn't going to move. We know about the student coordinating committees, sit-ins at Woolworth's lunch counters. The one in Greensboro, North Carolina has special attention because that's really where it started. And an offshoot of that group later on started the Black Panthers. We know that Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech during the March on Washington was very incredible as it really mobilized a lot of people nationwide to do the right thing. Next slide, please. So you think that that would be all we would need? Well, racism hasn't stopped. If we go back to where the Ku Klux Klan began, it began with a group of Confederate soldiers who put a club, a boys' club together. What they would do is go around and kidnap Blacks and lynch them. That's how the Ku Klux Klan started. An offshoot of this, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, historically, the police departments in the South were self-deputized individuals who went around, kidnapped Black people, and lynched them. And that is how police departments started in the Deep South. So let's come forward to 2020. We still know through the Southern Poverty Law Center that there are as many as nearly 1,000 hate groups in America today. Next slide, please. So modern day racism, the FBI did publish a report several years ago that they believe white supremacy is infiltrating our police departments throughout our country. That's not to say every policeman is bad. And I know that's not true. We know that's not true. This is reality that we're facing. As recent as last week, CBS, along with the LA Times, reported suspicion that there is an actual gang, a tattooed gang amongst the sheriff's department in LA who are going around antagonizing African-American men. So this gives us a picture from history up to today, but it doesn't stop here. Next slide, please. So there have been a number of corporations that have given public apologies because they have indirect or direct ties to slavery. As a result of this, I will, to their credit, say that any Southern African American person that can connect their heritage back to slavery, they give them a full ride scholarship into any university. But these are some of the companies that have admitted, and you can find all this in literature. Next slide, there's a feed that I give. If you don't like this feed, you can find others. Please go to the next slide. We're not going to show it. If that wasn't enough, Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, Yale, Georgetown, University of Virginia, which, by the way, Jefferson started, they all admit to connections to slavery. In fact, Harvard has a plaque of where a slave was actually buried on the grounds. Harvard also used some of the money that they got through slavery to give scholarships to students. What these universities are doing today, I was able to find out. But I just wanted to give you a snapshot of how throughout history, throughout the reality of existing in this nation, Blacks have not necessarily felt welcomed as equal participants to contribute to or benefit from the society in which we live. Okay, I'm a faculty counselor. I have my own issues around these things. I'm going to share a little bit later, but I also want you to know, because I work for students, I have heard so many stories of these students. And let me tell you, they may not know specifics with history, but they know. They know they're not welcome. They can feel it. Okay, let's go on, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, right here. So what we're going to do is just show you a snapshot. In spite of all these things, we have never stopped pushing. We have never stopped going on and doing things. If we look at some of these leaders during anti-slavery movement, next slide, please. During the civil rights movement, all these leaders, we've never stopped marching. We've never stopped pushing on. Next slide. Just want to give you a visual of what Black folks have contributed. Some of our religious leaders. Next slide, please. And these are not exhaustive lists, by the way. Academic leaders. Next slide. Doctors, scientists, inventors. Keith Black is at Cedars-Sinai. He's the #1 neurosurgeon in the nation, in case you don't know who he is. He also teaches at UCLA. Patricia Bath, who we lost a couple of years ago, she designed a machine that gets rid of cataracts. Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's an astrophysicist. He's always discovering some new planet or doing something like that. Next slide, please. Military figures. We've made inroads in all these different places in our society. Next slide, please. Lawyers, judges, and legal people, writers. You can go on. Go on. Continue with writers. I can't even name them. There's just so many. Musicians and groups. Y'all know them. Musicians and groups. Keep going, please. Just to give you a snapshot. I want you to get a sense of this. Of all the things that Black folk have contributed to a nation where they've not felt welcome. We don't give up. We don't quit. And we like to get into good trouble, as John Robert Lewis has been known to say. So this is an interesting slide. One of the things I learned, Oliver Lewis, who was a jockey, he actually rode in the very first Kentucky Derby, and he won. Who would have known that in 1875 that they even allowed a Black man down there to do it? And on top of that, he won. I'm sure y'all didn't get that in history, so I just gave you a little something. Because we saw these snippets and we didn't get a chance to linger on any, I want you to linger on this. The next time you're in your car and you stop at a traffic sign, when you see the light turn from red to green to yellow, the name Garrett Morgan should come into your mind. He was a Black man. He created the traffic signal. He also created the first gas mask that started before it went on to, I guess, what firemen use today. So this is just to give you a snapshot of who we are, what we've done, what we continue to do in spite of what we face. Next slide, please. So this first question topic, Blacks have not been welcome as equal participants who contribute to or benefit from society in which we live. When we get to our breakout group, the question that goes with that we're going to look at is, how has this discussion space, since y'all started this space, how has it inspired you to take action to benefit members of the Black community? Okay? All right, the next one, please. And I'll turn it back over to my colleague, Marlon.
All right, thank you for that history lesson and all of those figures. The next topic that we would go to is we're gonna make this a little bit more personal. We're gonna share some of our experiences that we've had experiencing anti-Blackness in various different avenues of our lives. And what we want to invite you to think about is, what sort of experience have you shared or are willing to share that speaks to your alliance with the Black struggle and how you're prepared to engage in anti-Blackness. And so it was an interesting sort of development when Paulette and Abram and I were working on this and deciding to be vulnerable. The question came up, what we're going to share, why we're sharing it, you know, what is the purpose of some of these stories we're going to share with you. And for me, three things came to mind when I discovered being Black and what was different about that. When it was reinforced to me what my Blackness was by non-Black people on me, and then the impression that I got from others about myself and my Blackness. So it might be different in different cultures, but one of the things that I've experienced and that I've talked to other people in the community about is what we call a first Black moment. And for those of you that maybe don't know or are not familiar with kind of what that means contextually, is a moment in life where, you know, we found out what being Black meant for us, that we were different in some way, and that just because of our skin tone or the community that we come from, we were going to be treated differently. And so what I wanted to share was my first Black experience. I was in the 3rd grade, and I was living in a city called Buena Park in Southern California. And across the street from us, across the street and around the block, was a candy house. I don't know if any of you remember candy houses, right? little family stores that they would set up. And my mom would never let me go to that store alone, right? And so, you know, I'm in the 3rd grade, I'm a big boy now, let me go try, right? It's just around the corner, let me try. And she was very hesitant to let me do so. And one day she said, okay, you can go, right? And so I walked over there, I had $2, she gave me $2, I walked over there, I'm gonna get some candy or whatever, right? And I wasn't thinking, you know, why my mom was hesitant to let me go to that place. But when I walked into that market, the owner, Korean man and his family who lived upstairs, but the second that I walked in by myself, this store owner became very interested in me. He would follow me around. Every couple minutes, you know, when he would walk away, he would yell back over his shoulder, hey, what are you doing? And he would yell out the prices to me of everything as I picked those items up. So I remember picking up a Snickers bar. That's $1, right? Picked up those little sour Twizzler things, right? $1.50, yelling at me from across the store what things were, following me when I was out of sight. And so I finally picked something. I was so confused as to why this was happening. I picked something out, I paid for it, it was $1.50. He took the $2 and he sort of tossed 2 quarters at me, right? And so I had to walk back home, and I remember my mom waiting for me outside of our apartment building, right? Because she was watching to see when I came back. And I remember seeing her and I started crying because I didn't know exactly what this was, but I knew something had happened, right? Something happened to me that I didn't expect to happen. I did not know why. And my mother and I had to have a conversation around what was happening, why I was being looked at that way, talked to that way, followed around that way. And it was the first moment in my life that I can recall that I realized I was different just because of what I was and who I was, right? This man didn't know me. He never had a reason to suspect me. I'd never stolen anything from him. But because of who I was suspect. And I, as a third grade kid, was crying to my mother about this, and she had to explain to me that I was different. Okay. As we move on, people tell you and they show you how you were different. So I'm gonna skip from the third grade all the way to my first year in college. My first year in college, coming home from summer vacation, I was very sick. And my mom took me to the hospital. And I went to the emergency room, and that emergency room, for some reason, was calling back like groups of people at a time. And I remember the nurse sat us back on a wall, and there were 5 people ahead of me, none of which I could clearly see were Black, right? They all appeared to be something other than African-American. That was just my assumption at the time. So the nurse went down and quickly asked all 5 of them. The immediate question was, what's wrong? What are you experiencing? How long have you been experiencing that? What are some of your symptoms, right? And I could tell he was giving that same set of questions to each of the 5 people that were before me in this waiting line, right? And when he got to me, the very first question out of his mouth is, are you on any substances? Have you used any drugs today? Is there anything going on that I should know about, right? Implying that some reason I was there was drug related, or, you know, something that I had done personally landed me in the emergency room to seek help, right? So I didn't get the, how is everything? How are you? What's wrong? What are your symptoms? What do you feel like you're experiencing? The first question I got, without even an introduction, are you on any substances? Have you taken anything, right? Don't know me from Adam. And I just watched you repeat 5 of those questions the same way, but you get to me and it's something different, right? And then the last experience is just in the workplace. And I won't go into it too much, but because a lot of you came to the First Healing Space and you heard this story. But I was on my way home from private practice in San Bernardino County. And I was pulled over by a cop on the freeway because he was in one lane, I was in the other. I passed him. He pulled me over because he said I was speeding past him. I said, officer, I was just going with the flow of traffic. But it was a big ordeal. Or I took the lessons that I learned as a Black man, right? 10 and 2, don't be combative, don't be confrontational, right? And when he saw me in this very still space, you know, with his hand on his gun, he asked me, is there a problem? Are you nervous? Is there something you should be worried about, right? And so we go back and forth, but the last thing he told me before he let me go with a warning only because I worked at the county at that time and he saw my badge. The thing that he said to me, and I'll never forget it, because I told him I was a therapist, right? And he looked at me and he said, you know, I bet you've never helped anybody in your practice. I bet that the way you are and the person that you are, you've probably never helped anyone. Doesn't know me from Adam, doesn't know what I do, how I help, where I help, but thought enough of me during a traffic stop to tell me that in my career choice, I've probably never helped anybody. And so these are experiences where they tell you you're different, they show you you're different, and then they treat you like you're different. And that has been part of my experience with being a Black man in this country. And so I invite you to think about those experiences and how many of the people we know could have had experiences similar to that. And with that, I will pass it back to Dr. Paulette.
Thanks, Marlon, for sharing your stories with us. And I want you all to know that we're sharing our stories because we want to be transparent and we want to be real, so that you will understand it's not just someone that you see on television, but it's someone who you know on campus. So I'm going to just share 2 stories. I have so many. The first story I'm going to share, it has to do with how I've been able to help mitigate the struggle. I grew up on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and when I was 19, I was very involved with social activism because I came from parents who were social activists. And so true to form, there I was. I joined what was called the Cape Cod Community Action Committee. And what we did was we went about to bring about as many anti-racist activities as we could. And one such thing was brought to us. We heard about a restaurant that was about to open up near the Hyannis Rotary. And the name of the restaurant was called Sambo's. And if any of you need an education later, I can tell you what Sambo means, but I encourage you to find out that on your own. But let me just say it's a very derogatory term that is used towards Black folk. So myself and one of the local rabbis were elected as the co-chairs to put the picket lines together. And so we put the schedules up, and we did it in such a way that from the time the restaurant opened to the time it closed, that there was always someone on the picket line with signs. And so I was out there with a group of people one day doing my thing, and cars would stop, slow down, and they would spit on us. Cars would slow down and they would throw curse words at us and the N-word at us and things like that. In about a week or so, the manager, I started working on him and explaining to him why to open such a restaurant was not a good idea. And in about 2 weeks, I was able to convince him, and he actually quit. He left the job. And in about a month or so, there was so much pressure and so much media attention put on this restaurant that the restaurant never opened. They had their beginning of their open house, but they didn't make it past a week. And so there has never been a Sambo's restaurant on Cape Cod. I was very proud of that. You know, as I think about this, I can remember a few years before that, I had actually had the opportunity to go to my older brother's graduation from Bates College. And the keynote speaker was Miss Coretta Scott King. And my mom and I went to the ladies' room before the ceremony started. And as we did, lo and behold, we ran into Coretta Scott King. It was 15 minutes of the most memorable times in my life. I was very shocked that the woman did not have hatred in her eyes. And she was more interested in hearing about us than telling us about what she had been through. And I realized that everything that she had done up until that time had come from a place of love and caring for everybody. And so I knew that that was the way in which I needed to go, which was probably why I spent time with that manager at that restaurant and helped him understand why what he was doing was not a good thing. So the second story I'm going to share does not have a good ending, but I think it's important that you hear it. So I went to school to get my grad degree somewhere in the valley. I won't say where it is. And I went to the bank one day, and as I was coming out of the bank, it was in a big strip mall, and I walked into an area where cars would go by as pedestrians walked in and out to get to our cars. There were two people immediately in front of me, and so it was like 1, 2, 3 in line. We were walking towards our cars. As we were doing that, there was a man coming slowly with his car towards us, and he could see the three of us were there. And so he rolled his window down, and he put his hand out the window, and he told us to go ahead, pass in front of him. So we kept walking. The two people in front of me had just about cleared where his car would have been. I guess he could see that I was Black. I mean, I've always been Black, but I guess he could see it in that moment, because what he did was he actually turned his wheel towards my body and he stepped on the gas. And it took all I could do to move my body forward and to keep that motion going. And just in time, I got out of the frame of his car and I fell on the ground. And when I looked up, his face was fiery red, and he said to me, and I will quote, "You Black effing nigga bitch." And I just was bewildered on the ground. In that moment, a white woman came over to me. She helped me up. She literally held me because my whole body was shaking. And she said to me, "You know, I saw the whole thing. I can't believe that man did that to you." She said, "Let's call the police." And I said, "No, please don't. Please don't." Sometimes we want to involve help and other times we don't. And that was one day when I needed to just take that experience and absorb it. And to this day, whenever I hear about these things that are happening with my folk, stories like the one I just told come up, and trust me, I have a lot more. But I wanted to share that with you. Thank you. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Abram.
You know, everyone with these definitely just power and humbling kind of experiences. I just wanted to share a couple of my stories before we go into this next component, because we come from different perspectives. I just want to reflect on mine today about talking about some of my educational journey, about where I am and what led to it. I can remember when I was younger, had to be in elementary school. Many of you have read about the things about racial bias that goes in assessments and profiling and things like that. And this thing that I'm reflecting on now, I really didn't realize until much later in life, actually, is when I was younger, by chance, they did one of those assessments, did a psychological assessment or some intelligence assessment or something. I don't really remember the details now. But what I do remember is after this assessment that they had put me in a LD, a learning disabled class. And I always found it kind of strange because I didn't understand like why I was there and things like that in relation to my class. Obviously, I saw people that looked like me. Most of y'all can tell from my accent that you're hearing from the South in Georgia, right? About why I was in this class. And, you know, at some point, I was like, what is going on? But eventually I was, you know, I guess they took another test and I got pulled out of it. It wasn't until later on in life that I talked with my mothers that they had put me in this LD class, which clearly I know that I wasn't supposed to be in, but then through my own research, finding out that it was quite often that students of color or specifically Blacks would get put in some of these things about to my education because of prejudice or what have you, and about how that kind of made me feel. And, you know, seeing in the book, I think it was in the book that I read that I came to that realization about that experience, right? And about saying about how they tried to marginalize my experience. I would like to say that something or events like that that happened was something way in the past when I was younger, like that. But then I want to share a kind of more recent story to you. Was on the tail end of after when I was in the midst of my PhD graduate program. That there was a time that I was in a class and we had started bringing up to talk about race and social justice. And I had one of the faculty that was in the class, and this is a true story, that within the class, they were saying, hey, you know, there was a time frame that I was going to look for a home. And during that time when I was looking for this home, I had found out that some Blacks had previously owned the home. And I had a reaction about buying that home. Now, this faculty didn't go on to try to elaborate about what was going on or why did they make the statement, just kind of left it there. And that really put me in a weird space because some of you who may know me is that as I was going through my graduate program, hear me a proud Marine and things like that that were very voices, but felt paralyzed but then and kind of shocked. And, you know, having to take that information in kind of to myself and didn't know what to do with it then. I mean, I felt like I learned some things now, but about that experience, right? But with these kind of different kind of things, we think on these, which want each and every one of y'all to kind of just reflect on. I mean, there's plenty more I can tell you about interactions with police or other kind of stuff. Or when I moved to California, we know the stories, but these are particular things. So with this, it's more about now that after y'all heard these stories, after you heard the presentation from Paulette, that now we get a chance to let you process with each other. So at this particular time, we want to now, as a reminder, we want to break down into those discussion groups and spend a few moments talking on question one, discussion question one and discussion question two, and then we'll come back to reflect. So at this particular point in time, I want to turn over, maybe Paulette, if somebody can help me saying about who wants to kind of give the members guidance about the timing and about how long we're going to be in the groups right now.
Thanks, Abram. I guess Amber is our tech person. We're going to be in 3 different groups, and each of us will facilitate the breakout groups. So I think we have time for, we'll say 10 minutes for each question, and then we'll come back. How does that sound?
Yeah, if possible, like 10 minutes or so. Yeah, that'll put us within good timing.
And as facilitators, we have the discussion questions for both questions. And we'll see y'all back here in about 21, 22 minutes. Matters, just give people books to read. And in our own way, we can help educate each other by sharing books. And then with respect to the second question, what sort of experience have you shared or are willing to share that speaks to your alliance with the Black struggle? One of the things that came up, which I thought spoke very strongly to this, one of the people in our group talked about how she started her own group discussion in the community where she lives. In her neighborhood, they brought in speakers from other places to talk about some of the issues related to racism and what they can do as a community to make change. And then the other thing that was said is how important it is to just be in contact with everyone that we can to educate each other around the Black struggle. So those are the highlights from our group. Thank you.
Thanks.
I keep doing that mute thing. Okay. So from what we discussed in our group, there was a lot of different voices sharing a lot of different things in the first space. We talked about police and policing and hopefully changing the culture of the police atmosphere to kind of get rid of that, as they say, blue line, right, that divides police from citizens, and working to integrate everybody and seeing people as not above the law, but as people in service to the larger community and supporting the community, and making sure that the police are a resource, right, to help everybody, to serve everyone. We also talked about using our space and whatever we have the capacity to do to advocate, right? One of our group members, you know, is a writer and wrote a journal article to be put out in her community that addressed Black Lives Matter. There were others that commissioned people to do art to support Black Lives Matter, and maybe intentionally using Black artists to do so, so reinvesting in the community as well. So there was talk around, you know, even the smallest gesture to the largest gesture can be advocacy, and it doesn't always have to look the same in the same way for everyone, but that we can all make intentional moves to do something to support and progress the thought of anti-racism and erase anti-Blackness. And then for the second question, some of us were talking about, you know, internally, if we're an ally, right, and we don't occupy the same space and cultural identity, internally processing and developing that empathy so that you can be a better ally to others. Talking about experiences where we may have gone to different places and have been the other, right, not the majority group, and how that felt and what impressions that gave us, and how it can lead to higher levels of empathy because we understand then what it feels like to be the other, right? Or to, you know, be asked if you know another white person, right? Because all of you might know each other, right? Or, you know, if certain words or phrases have been used to you that were foreign or that didn't necessarily make sense because you hadn't experienced that like that before. So just a short summary, but those are some of the things that we talked about in our group. So Abram, I will pass it on to you. You're muted, sir.
I could have sworn I unmuted that today. It seemed like, man, that's been going on. I think this thing is doing it by itself. All right, so with some of the themes within the group that I had is that when in relation to question 1, this desire, as someone mentioned, about kind of giving back to the community, right? About how they kind of taking action. Other things we're saying about definitely speaking up where before it would have been quiet. It may not have kind of spoke up to try to do advocacy, right? there was also acknowledgement about saying about some people about acknowledging that the privilege they originally had where, you know, they was on that other end about listening to these things about now saying, hey, that they want to take action, right? And notice about their privilege and about how they can use their privilege to support the Black community. And then they was talking about a feeling of hope in relation about knowing about some of these students and about our own personal younger family members, about how they're in different places and different knowledge places, and about how they're going to continue these youngsters and, you know, in relation to supporting, you know, kind of Black lives. And then with that motivates others, motivates themselves to go out there and support. In relation to question, discussion question 2, we was talking about these things about the fear sometimes about what can we do, especially when COVID is still going on, where we may not be able to protest, but we may be able to do other things like speak within our classes or donate money or speak to family about some of those different alternatives, right? And then to continue educating ourselves and to advocate within our local governments or within the CSUN environment, right? It's about things we can change locally within those spaces, right? And then there's conversations about about being more humanistic or being kind of human in the classroom, not just kind of going about tasks, but definitely going and exploring about how we can kind of acknowledge these students' realities right now, right? And then lastly, about being intentional, right? So those are a lot of the things that we was talking there. But now we want to go, if you can go to that topic question number 3, real quick as we're going there. We wanted to spend a few moments since we have the larger mass together, we may can get you know, a few people to speak before we go into our final part. As you can see on the screen, what do you believe you can realistically do to help make a change at CSUN moving forward? And at this point, for many of you, you can kind of call it. I know we got a lot of numbers, so it'll be hard for me to see, but feel free to raise your hand and one of the hosts can let us know if there's a speaker there. Go ahead.
Dr. Abram, yes, something I forgot to mention that Dr. Spector just reminded me. In our group, I said about 5 times, we need to vote. We need to vote, we need to vote.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely talking about like voting. Oh yes, on your one topic, right? Absolutely.
And part of that is educating our students the importance of that, the importance of their advocacy to become better contributors within the society in which they live.
Okay, yes, definitely, thanks. So yeah, so before we go up, we'll go into that last little part. Were there 3 people that maybe want to be willing to, even if you want to put in the chat that you want to talk and we'll acknowledge you. I know there's a lot of people on the screen, but definitely if somebody wanted to kind of share, you know, I love the idea about them about voting, but realistically about change moving forward. Yeah. Okay, yeah, Audrey, I see you, but please, thank you, go ahead.
Hi. I think one of the things that's important to me, I'm from the English department, is to try to get students and people in general to understand exactly what white supremacy is. I think that until people, and especially our students, have a good foundation in understanding that white supremacy is not neo-Nazis and the KKK, all right? It's an understanding, a social and cultural and historical and political understanding that whiteness is key and everything else is outside of it. Then it's hard to move forward because people just say, well, that's not me. I wouldn't be a member of the KKK. I wouldn't be a neo-Nazi. I wouldn't do this or that. But we all do everything we do because we have an understanding that whiteness is the foundation of everything.
Yes, definitely. You know, thank you kind of for sharing on that one about saying about that underpinning about the oppression, right? Because sometimes on TV news and all that, they'll have us kind of highlight on this one thing, but saying about that system in itself. And right, and I kind of thank you on that. And for everyone else, you know, as we are kind of going, please y'all can put in the chat. But definitely I want to kind of acknowledge, because there was a couple of more slides that we needed to highlight on about kind of about the takeaways that we wanted to go. So if we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. I wanted to kind of talk on about saying about some of the takeaways and some of these things about in relation to awareness, right? So what we are hoping, we as the facilitators, Marlon, Paulette, and I, is for yourselves about saying, hey, what can I do with this information, Abram? Is this acceptance of the pain involved in overcoming racism, right? Sometimes it can bring up defensive feelings. Definitely takes up time and energy, right, to do the work. I can't emphasize that enough. But it does involve that long-term commitment. So we need to ask ourselves within our awareness, you know, how much long-term commitment we will continue here within CSUN, right? Because it is not a sprint, it is a marathon. Next slide, please. With this awareness, we also need to be willingness to be in uncomfortable spaces that forces interactions, right? And this involves examining unpleasant racial inequalities and accepting responsibility for that change. Can we respect this? You know, can we accept? We hear these things now, right? You're sitting in these spaces, you're hearing the stories. Can we accept, right? And then our next one is commitment to work against the injustice, which involves confronting relatives, friends, neighbors, right? When they tell these different kind of jokes, and involves about possibility of being ostracized by one's community, because we see this with some of the students, that when they bring up these things, that their families have different things, right? So just with that, with these kind of different awareness. So this awareness that comes with self is that generalized theme, knowing that it's gonna be hard, knowing that it's gonna be difficult, but then kind of pressing forward. And with that, I wanna turn it over to my colleague, Marlon, to cover some other thought processes.
All right, everybody, we're racing to the finish here. So what I wanted to go over with you today is some things that we got together and said, you know, there's some things that in order to promote anti-racism, we want to stop or refrain from saying or doing, and then introduce some things that might replace those things. So the first thing that we would like not to be said is all lives matter, right? And, you know, some people will say, why is that a bad thing? We say all lives matter. And that would be great if we had started off saying all lives matter, right? But for a lot of us, we realized that we didn't start saying all lives matter until certain people started saying Black lives matter, right? So if all lives mattered before, we wouldn't have had to say Black lives matter, right? So we need to understand the position that certain phrases are in and when they come up, right? The second thing is, I don't see color, right? Because there's only one race, the human race. If you don't see color, you don't see me, right? I go through a number of experiences as a Black person that I wouldn't if I was not. So if you don't see color, you don't see my life experience. You don't see my lived experience. So I want you to see color. I just want you to respect it when you do, right? And that's that one. Don't say, I'm here if you ever want to talk. We say that more in the ally space, right? Because, you know, sometimes things are sensitive and I may not want to reach out to my white friend or my non-Black friend to just share, right? That might not feel safe for me all the time. So what can we say, right? If you ever need someone to hold your anger, hold your hurt, your pain, I'm here to be a receptor for you, right? So that's different than just come talk to me. That's more like, I know there's something going on. There might be a lot of hurt and pain here. And if you need me to be there to help hold that for you, then I'm here, right? And then calling out others. So I want to step in with my MSW lens here, right? maybe instead of calling out, we call in or we call up, right? We call people in or we call them up to behave differently. Whenever you see something or hear something that is insensitive or offensive to Black people, what we don't need is more bystanders, right? More people that say, that's not me, I didn't say it, so I'm gonna just let that go. All of us need to speak up. And when you speak up in a culture or in a lane that you occupy the majority space in, your word means a lot. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, do your own research of Black history, achievements, and contributions. I've talked to a number of Black people, including myself, who are tired of giving history lessons, right? Because it seems like it becomes incumbent on the people who have been oppressed to explain and teach about their oppression. There have been so many books and articles and everything laid out and mapped out in videos. And I don't know if we realize that it can be re-traumatizing to a community sometimes to have to keep explaining why they're hurt. So if there's any research that you can do on your own, please educate yourself, right? And so you don't expect the people who are already dealing with a trauma in their own community to have to then stop and explain to you why they're being traumatized, right? And encourage people in your own life to do the same. Acknowledge that although you may not be responsible for the historical stain of slavery, you continue to benefit from the impact of it just by virtue of being white because of systematic racism. I don't know if I need to say much more about that than that, right? So I'm gonna leave that right there and let you all have that. Can we move to the next slide? Okay, so reach out to a willing Black colleague with the intention to have a real and difficult conversation. Ask them to share a story of a direct racist incident and how they mitigated it. Be willing to bear witness to their experience and hold their anger and pain if needed. We have to have difficult conversations so that people are aware of how we connect, how we interact, and how we differ, right? Because it's one thing to just say, oh yeah, institutional racism, that's bad, we need to get rid of it. It's another thing to know and feel and sit with someone who's explaining their story to you and really understanding it. We know most people don't move unless they feel something personally, right? And so in order to really understand, we have to have uncomfortable conversations where maybe people who look like us and feel like us aren't the hero in that story, but maybe the villain in that story, or maybe the bystander in that story. So sometimes we have to have those conversations just to understand and be able to empathize what it's like to be on the other side. Number 8, allow and promote discussions of race, ethnicity, culture, sexuality in your classrooms. Make connections to the context around which you teach your subject. So I know a lot of us are educators. We're going to be going back into the classroom in a couple weeks, and students, they don't live in a vacuum, right? They're going to be feeling, they're going to be experiencing all of these things and bringing it into your class. And what an opportunity that is to engage them in some meaningful discussions and teach your lesson at the same time, right? I think, you know, when we go back to our young man in the video at the beginning, asking us to create space and to make safe spaces safer, you know, what would it be like if we went into a classroom, the teacher talked for 60 minutes, didn't mention anything that was going on, versus coming in, talking to someone and sharing and discussing what's happening and how it's relevant to the subject that we're teaching. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I think we are, okay, so reach out to a willing Black colleague with the intention of having really difficult conversations. Admit a time when you may have made an insensitive comment related to Black people. Apologize without accepting forgiveness, and make a verbal commitment to do the right thing going forward. So this is not to say, go outside and say, I did it, I messed up, this is my fault. Well, it's saying, you know, let's be real and have real conversations about what you may have been privileged in your life, or what you may have experienced that led to acting differently around a certain group of people. and acknowledge it, right? We're again talking about having real and difficult conversations. To be silent is to be complicit to racism and its atrocities. It's important for you to find your voice. We all contribute in different ways. The talents and gifts you offer are needed. Yeah, silence is harmful, right? Silence can be violent at times when we sit and we don't address certain things. And that's why we have to move with intention to deconstruct some of this anti-Blackness that's in our society right now. And, you know, silence can be harmful because when we're silent towards a certain group and that group is oppressed, they go away sometimes, or they're diminished to a level where they're not important. But you know what? The silence doesn't stop there. They go to the next group and the next other group and the next other group after that. And so if we don't speak up for the least of these in our community, once they get rid of them, they're coming for the next group too. So we have to take a stand somewhere for some community, right? And why not start right now, right here, right? Next, please. Okay, attend a Black community event. Check that one off your list. You did that this week, but don't stop. Keep going, keep attending as many as you can. Educate yourself, be a part of the discussion so that you can be part of the solution, right? Actively reach out and educate that person who you believe is racist. Remember, you can connect with them in a way that Black folks cannot. In some spaces, I can't occupy the same space as someone else who maybe fits in with that community a little better or identifies with them more, right? And oftentimes when we hear voices coming from bodies that look like us and sound like us and speak the same way we do, we are more receptive to those ideas, right? And so, you know, sometimes it's not me sitting here telling you how anti-Blackness is rampant through the United States and through the world. Sometimes it takes you having a conversation with someone else in your community, telling them how you acknowledge that it's happened too, and that we need to do something about it. Become an advocate for Black events and programs. Consider supporting any of these through time, volunteerism, and financially. That's pretty straightforward. Let's go down to the next one. Okay, and lastly, acknowledge the differences between not being a racist and living as an anti-racist. And the only word that I represent there is intentionality, right? Not being a racist is simply not engaging in racist activities. Living as an anti-racist is intentionally moving to do something about what is happening, intentionally moving to deconstruct what is going on in society. So we have to make a choice. You know, some people come down on the, let me just stand on the side. That doesn't really help, right? So we have to move with intention to live as an anti-racist. And so for the next 3 slides are just supporting documents, articles, different resources that we found that, you know, contribute to the argument that I made, those 14 points for how to move in differently and how to move in anti-racist fashion. So because of time, I'm not going to go through all of these because I want to give Paulette a chance to finish up and take us out of here. But these resources can be available to you, and hopefully we will be able to post them somewhere and get them to you. But those are our resources, our lists, our articles for where we got a lot of this information from. So with that being said, I'm going to move back over to Paulette and let her take us out for the day.
Thanks, Marlon. Could we go to the slide after this one? Oh, okay. Yes. So we found a private school that has started their own anti-racist plan. And we, as a collective here at CSUN, are doing some of these things. And we just wanted to kind of put this out there so we all have sort of a backdrop to work from as we continue to do the good work that we're doing here, but to encourage us to keep doing more and to also look at another university that's doing some good stuff in this area. So University of Dayton, their anti-racist plan, I'm not going to elaborate on these because we don't have time, so I'm just going to read everyone, give a final word, and then we'll be out of here. So set the expectation that every faculty and staff member will engage in education about bias and privilege, systemic racism, the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the role we each must play to advance these values at our universities here as well. 2, advance the university's institutional learning goals of diversity and community by educating every undergraduate student through curricular and co-curricular vehicles about the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The next one, please. 3, promote relevant extracurricular learning opportunities for all. 4, strengthen efforts to diversify the student body. And then 5, implement an aggressive strategy to increase diversity and equity among faculty, staff, and administrators. Next slide, please. Continue to build a climate of safety. Deploy our marketing and communication assets to support diversity, equity, and inclusion. 8, strengthen mutually beneficial connections between the university and Black alumni and other alumni of color. Some of these things I really do believe we're doing, but it's just good to hear this from another perspective. 9, make more visible the history and legacy of African American community, as well as those of other communities that have traditionally been underrepresented. And that's something we have started and we can continue to work on here. 10, work with the African American community surrounding Northridge. I'm sure, as one of the people in my group talked about an initiative that she started, I know that there's a Black Lives Matter in Northridge because my husband and I went on a march earlier this year. And I know that there are all sorts of community activists that we can partner with. And that's what we need to be doing. Next slide, please. Expand the university's utilization of women and minority-owned businesses, including Black-owned businesses, with an emphasis on locally owned enterprises. And again, that's going into community. You know, we can't do this work alone. We must do it together. Some of you heard me give the quote by Audre Lorde, who said that change happens through community. And we're talking about making change to better the lives, not just for Black folk, but for all of us. You know, they say that Einstein was the smartest guy in the room, and Einstein was a member of the American Socialist Party back in the time when there was such a thing. And he made the comment of how a society moves forward to the degree that its least in society is taken care of. And so that's what we want y'all to go away with today. And then we commit ourselves to work with our faculty, staff, students, trustees, and alumni to take concrete action that will mark us here at CSUN as an anti-racist institution. We want to enhance the quality of our educational environment for all of our students and enhance the quality of life for Black members here of our community, as well as all marginalized communities here on our campus. So these are the things that we wanted to bring to you today. These 3 areas we hope has not only whetted your appetite, but has gotten you to the place where you're willing to become an anti-racist intentionally, as Marlon has said, if you haven't already. It's not enough to be non-racist. We must all become anti-racist to see the world become the world in which we want to live and to see the world that we want to have for our future. I think we may have a couple announcements before we say so long. There's been a couple of you that have asked about the essential talks that the 3 of us, Marlon, Abram, and I have been doing. And I hope, Jessica, that you're still here. And if you are, that you can give us an update as to what's happening with the essential talks. Is Jessica still here?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, all of you. It's always a pleasure to be in presence with you all and learn from you. But for those of you who don't know, the USU, in collaboration with University Counseling Services, has been hosting what was formerly called Healing Spaces in response to George Floyd's death. And we've continued to have them over the last couple of weeks and really focusing on different themes and different injustices that impact the Black community. So we've decided to put a hold on those healing spaces, and we're strategizing on how we can implement this. Well, now they'll be called essential talks for the upcoming semester, you know, because we realize that a lot of the conversations that we're having are essential, right? So during these spaces, we're talking about different injustices that impact the Black community, and also too, I think what we can do in our departments, in our areas, and on our campus to bring about social change. As of now, the first one that we have coming up will be probably the first week of the fall semester, and we're hoping to continue these conversations once a month. Once we have all the confirmed dates and times, I will definitely send you or send the hosts from the Zoom all that information to get that out to you all. And I highly, highly encourage you to attend, and to continue to have these conversations moving forward.